In the late spring of 1971, a young woman named Helen Marsh walked into the St. Tine Landry Parish clerk's office, her footsteps unnaturally quiet on the worn linoleum floors. She was 24 years old, with a face that held the son's attention and hands that were already learning the language of hard work. She was there to complete a transaction that the clerk, a man named Gerald who had stamped papers in that same office for 3 decades, would talk about for years to come. She was paying $50, the entirety of her savings, for the deed to a 40-acre parcel of land the county had repossessed for delinquent taxes. The parcel had a name on the county map, Black Cypress Basin, but everyone in town just called it the Bog. It was a piece of Louisiana so thoroughly saturated with water, so choked with cypress knees and swarming with mosquitoes, that no one had even bothered to try and farm it, log it, or live on it for a generation. It was considered utterly, unequivocally worthless. Gerald the clerk took her $50, counted it twice as if the amount itself were a misprint, and slid the deed across the counter. He didn't laugh, not out loud, but a small, dry chuckle escaped his throat, a sound like rustling leaves. He peered at Helen over the top of his spectacles. "You sure about this, miss? That land, it's got more water than dirt, more snakes than birds." Helen simply nodded, her gaze steady. She folded the deed, a single crisp piece of paper that represented a future no one else could see, and placed it in her bag. "I'm sure," she said, and her voice, though soft, carried a finality that left no room for argument. She turned and walked out, leaving behind the scent of fresh air and the profound, echoing silence of a decision that made no sense to anyone. The story of the girl who bought the bog was already spreading through the town before she even reached the end of the courthouse steps. Now, let me tell you about the town and the man who would become the chief architect of Helen's public ridicule. This was a place built on the firm foundation of conventional wisdom. Land had value if it was high, dry, and could be plowed in neat rows for cotton or sugarcane. Wealth was measured in cleared acreage, in the number of cattle you owned, in the size of your barn. Anything else was folly. The loudest voice of this conventional wisdom belonged to a man named Silas Croft. Croft was a landowner of considerable means, with hundreds of acres of prime, fertile soil that his family had farmed for a century. He was a big man with a booming voice who held court every morning at the town diner, his pronouncements on weather, politics, and the price of cotton treated as gospel. When news of Helen's purchase reached him, he let out a great, rolling laugh that shook the sugar dispensers on the table. $50? He bellowed, to the delight of the other farmers nursing their coffee. She didn't buy land, she bought a mosquito nursery. Paid $50 for the privilege of getting eaten alive. From that day forward, Helen and her swamp became his favorite punchline. He would see her in town, loading supplies into her old, rusted truck, and call out from across the street, "How's the mud farming, Helen? Struck brown gold yet?" His laughter would follow her as she drove away, a constant, grating reminder of her isolation. The town, taking its cue from him, settled into a collective judgment. They saw her not as a pioneer, but as a pitiable, misguided girl. A fool. They were certain of it. He was wrong. The men gathered in that dusty diner had been farming this parish since before she was a thought, and they believed they knew exactly what they were seeing in her. They saw a young woman, alone, with no family money and no husband, wasting her youth and her meager funds on a hopeless cause. What they could not see, what they were incapable of even imagining, was the knowledge she carried inside her. It was a legacy, a secret inheritance far more valuable than Silas Croft's cleared fields. It was a different way of seeing the world, a language that allowed her to read the story written in the water, the mud, and the light. Let me explain. Helen's father was not a farmer. He had been a quiet, thoughtful man, a professor of biology at a small college who spent his weekends not on a tractor, but in a flat-bottomed boat. He was a wetland ecologist before that term had any real meaning to the general public. While other fathers taught their children how to plow a field or fix a fence, he had taught Helen how to measure the pH of water, how to identify the larvae of 100 different insects, how to read the health of an ecosystem in the color of its algae. Their classroom had been the bayous and swamps of southern Louisiana. He carried with him a small leather-bound kit with vials and testing strips and a notebook he filled with meticulous, spidery handwriting. He had a philosophy that he repeated to her often, his voice low and patient as they drifted through the shadowed waterways. "Everyone looks at a swamp and sees a problem to be solved," he would say, pointing to a great blue heron stalking its prey in the shallows. "They see chaos. They want to drain it, fill it in, pave it over, turn it into something neat and predictable. They think it's wasteland." He would pause, letting the truth of it settle. "They're wrong, Helen. A swamp isn't wasteland. It's an engine. It's the most powerful, productive biological engine on the planet. It creates more life, more biomass per square foot than any other environment. You just have to understand how it works. You have to learn to read the dials." When he passed away 2 years prior, he left Helen very little in the way of money or property. His tangible legacy consisted of a small, cluttered office, a lifetime of books, and a wooden crate containing 24 of his field journals. These journals were Helen's inheritance. They were not diaries filled with feelings, but scientific logs, a scrupulous record of his explorations. They were filled with data, tables of dissolved oxygen levels, notes on water turbidity, seasonal variations in nutrient loads, detailed drawings of sediment layers, and lists of flora and fauna observed. He had spent the better part of a decade studying the intricate water systems of their home parish. And in the 17th volume, Helen had found what she was looking for. There was a chapter titled simply Black Cypress Basin. For 12 pages, her father had detailed the unique and overlooked characteristics of the very swamp she now owned. He had discovered that the basin was fed not just by rain and runoff, but by a deep, slow-moving artesian spring. This constant, subtle current prevented the water from becoming truly stagnant and anoxic, the fate of most landlocked swamps. He wrote about the soil, which he described not as mud, but as a nutrient-dense colloidal suspension. He'd analyzed it and found it was extraordinarily rich in organic detritus from a specific ancient grove of cypress trees, a composition he believed was the perfect food source for the microscopic life that formed the base of the entire aquatic food web. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever held a truth so firmly that the laughter of the world sounds like a distant, irrelevant noise? This was Helen in the summer of 1971. While the town saw a stagnant bog, she saw, through her father's eyes, a perfectly calibrated engine. While they saw mosquitoes and snakes, she saw a self-sustaining nursery. The conventional wisdom in the burgeoning field of aquaculture at the time was clear. You needed concrete ponds, expensive filtration systems, and scientifically formulated, protein-rich feed pellets to grow fish commercially. It was a capital-intensive, high-input business. Helen knew better. She had read her father's conclusion written in his confident, looping script. The basin is not a container for water. It is a factory for life. To introduce artificial feed would be redundant, even harmful. The system itself is the feed. That was the secret. That was the core of her $50 gamble. The swamp wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was the solution waiting to be unlocked. Her work began not with bulldozers and dynamite, but with a quiet, methodical patience. She took her small boat, a second-hand pirogue, and spent weeks just observing. She followed the almost imperceptible currents her father had described. She took her own water samples, comparing her findings to his notes from a decade earlier. They were nearly identical. The engine was still running. Then, the real labor started. She bought rolls of galvanized wire mesh, shovels, and a heavy-duty post driver. She did not try to drain the swamp. She did not try to clear it. Her goal was to choreograph it. Wading waist-deep in the dark, cool water, she began to section off the basin. She built low, wide levees, not of concrete, but of packed mud and clay from the swamp floor itself, reinforced with fallen cypress logs. These levees followed the natural contours of the land, creating a series of interconnected ponds, each a few acres in size. It was grueling, back-breaking work. The humidity was a physical weight. The mosquitoes were a constant, whining shroud. She worked from sunrise to sunset, her body aching, her hands raw and blistered. The town watched her toil from a distance. They saw her, a lone figure swallowed by the immense, wild landscape, and they shook their heads. "Building mud pies," Silas Croft scoffed to his audience at the diner. "That girl's got more grit than sense." After 3 months of relentless labor, she had 4 distinct ponds, connected by simple channels she could open or close with mesh gates she'd fabricated herself. This was her system. She would allow the nutrient-rich water from the main body of the swamp to flow into one pond, letting the algae and zooplankton bloom in the sun. Then, she would introduce fish to that pond. Once they had grazed it down, she would move them to the next pond, which had been charging with new life in the meantime. It was a rotational grazing system, but with water instead of grass and fish instead of cattle. She was farming the ecosystem itself. In the fall, she drove to a hatchery 2 counties over and bought 1,000-channel catfish fingerlings, tiny silver slivers of life that she transported in aerated barrels. She released them into her first pond, and then she waited. The subsequent 2 years were a masterclass in patience and a testament to solitary faith. Helen's life fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the water. She rose before dawn, pulled her pirogue out onto the silent water, and began her work. She monitored the ponds, managed the flow of water through her simple gates, and reinforced her mud levees. She lived in a tiny, dilapidated shack on the edge of the property that had come with the land, repairing it just enough to keep the rain out. She was utterly alone, but she did not feel lonely. She was in constant conversation with the land, with the memory of her father, with the quiet, growing life beneath the surface of the water. The whispers of the community never ceased. Her isolation was interpreted as shame, her hard work as a fool's errand. Silas Croft, having grown bored of simple mockery, took to fabricating stories. He told people he'd heard she was trying to grow rice in the water, that she was trying to trap and sell snakes. Each story was more absurd than the last, but they all served the same purpose, to reinforce the idea that she was an outsider, a weirdling who didn't understand the proper way of things. Her project wasn't just a failure in their eyes, it was an affront to their way of life. There was a moment, in the heart of her second summer, when her faith wavered. A massive thunderstorm, one of those violent Gulf Coast squalls, blew in with unexpected fury. The wind tore at her little shack, and the rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. For hours, the storm raged. When the sun finally broke through the next morning, she pulled out to find a scene of devastation. A huge cypress, weakened by the wind, had fallen and smashed through the central levee connecting her 2 most important ponds. The water levels were equalizing, her careful separation of the grazing cycles ruined. She stood in the boat, covered in mud, drenched, and utterly exhausted. For the first time, the scale of her task seemed impossible. The voices of the town, of Silas Croft, echoed in her head. Mud farming, mosquito nursery, A fool's errand. She felt a profound, crushing wave of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe her father was a brilliant man, but a dreamer. Maybe a swamp was just a swamp. She returned to her shack, defeated. She sat at her small, rickety table and thought about quitting, about selling the useless deed back to the county for whatever she could get and leaving this place forever. Her eyes fell on the wooden crate in the corner, the one containing her father's journals. She pulled out volume 17, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it to the chapter on the basin. Her father's neat script seemed to speak to her from the page. He wrote about the resilience of the swamp, how it absorbed shocks like storms, how its interconnectedness was a strength, not a weakness. He had one underlined sentence: "The system always seeks to heal itself." Reading those words, she felt his quiet, unshakable confidence flow back into her. This was not a catastrophe, it was a setback. The engine was still there. She took a deep breath, closed the journal, and went back outside. The work was not over. By the end of that second year, the first signs of undeniable success began to emerge. These were not loud, public victories, but quiet, private truths. She began to test net the fish. The fingerlings she had introduced were now over 2 pounds each, a growth rate that was nearly double the standard for farm-raised catfish. But it was not just their size. Their bodies were thick and muscular. When she cleaned one, she found the flesh was firm, almost pearlescent, with a clean, sweet smell devoid of the muddy taste that plagued so many bottom feeders. She cooked a fillet over her small fire. The flavor was extraordinarily rich, buttery, and complex. It tasted of the clean water and the rich life of the swamp. It was the taste of her father's theory made real. The swamp wasn't just growing fish, it was creating a superior product. Now, having a superior product and selling it are two very different challenges. In the spring of 1974, Helen decided it was time. She netted 100 pounds of her finest fish, packed them on ice in a cooler, and drove her old truck into town to the local fish market. The owner, a man named Dubois, was a creature of habit. He bought his fish from the same handful of commercial fishermen and pond farmers he'd been dealing with for 20 years. He looked at Helen, her clothes still damp and smelling of the swamp, and then at the large, beautiful fish in her cooler. His face soured with suspicion. "Where did you catch these?" he asked, his arms crossed. "I don't catch them. I raise them," Helen replied calmly. Dubois let out a short, derisive snort. "Raise them? In that bog out on the old parish road? Daughter, nobody wants to eat a mud fish from a snake pit. I sell clean fish here." He wouldn't even touch one. He waved a dismissive hand and turned back to his work, leaving Helen standing there with her 100 pounds of liquid gold, suddenly feeling as worthless as the town believed her land to be. She met the same resistance from the 2 other small grocers in the area. They judged her operation by its appearance, by the reputation Silas Croft had so carefully crafted for her. They saw the mud on her boots and assumed it was in her product. She drove home that day with all of her fish, the weight of the unsold ice, a cold lump in her stomach. The turning point came, as it so often does, not as a plan, but as an accident. A few weeks later, a refrigerated truck bearing the logo of a high-end seafood distributor from New Orleans blew a tire just a quarter-mile from Helen's property. The driver, a man named Marcus, was a buyer, not just a trucker. His job was to source the best and most unique products for the city's finest restaurants. While waiting for a repair truck, he took a walk to stretch his legs and followed the dirt track leading toward the swamp out of sheer curiosity. He saw Helen in her pirogue, pulling a net heavy with large, thrashing catfish. Marcus had seen thousands of catfish in his career, but there was something different about these. They looked impossibly healthy, vibrant. He approached her as she docked the small boat. He didn't ask where she was from or who she was. He was a professional, and he spoke the language of product. "That's a good-looking fish," he said, pointing at a particularly large one. "Unusual color. Healthy." Helen, wary from her previous rejections, simply nodded. "Can I see one?" he asked. She took the large fish from the net and laid it on the clean boards of her small dock. Marcus knelt. He didn't just look at it, he studied it. He ran a hand over its smooth skin, checked the clarity of its eyes, the deep red of its gills. Then he did something that surprised her. He took a small, razor-sharp pocket knife from his coat, expertly sliced a tiny sliver of flesh from the fish's flank, and placed it on his tongue. His eyes, which had been narrowed in professional assessment, widened in genuine shock. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. He had tasted catfish from every supplier in 3 states. He knew the muddy tang of a stagnant pond, the bland flavor of fish raised on cheap grain pellets. This was something else entirely. It was clean, sweet, with a firm texture and a subtle, complex finish. It tasted of a pristine environment. He stood up, wiping his knife. He looked from the fish to the dark, living water of the swamp, and then to Helen. For the first time, he seemed to truly see her. "What do you want for them?" he asked, his voice low. Helen hesitated for a second, remembering the sting of Dubois' rejection. Then she remembered the feel of her father's journal, the weight of her own hard work. She looked him in the eye. $1 a pound, she said. It was an audacious price, nearly double the going rate for standard farm-raised catfish. Marcus didn't blink. He didn't haggle. He looked at the 100 or so fish in her net. "I'll take all of them," he said. "Cash. And I'll be back next week for the same amount. Don't sell to anyone else." He paid her from a thick roll of bills in his pocket, and by the time the tow truck arrived, Helen's $50 swamp had produced its first real profit. Marcus was a man of his word, and he was a man who understood the value of a secret. He didn't advertise his discovery. He introduced the black cypress catfish to 2 of the most renowned chefs in the French Quarter. He told them the story a secret, pristine swamp, a proprietary ecosystem, and let the product speak for itself. The chefs, always searching for an edge, for a superior ingredient that could not be easily replicated, were enthralled. The word began to spread, not through newspapers or radio ads, but through the closed, powerful network of the culinary world. It moved from one chef to another, from a wholesaler in Baton Rouge to a specialty market in Biloxi, Mississippi, then to another in Mobile, Alabama. Within a year, the dirt track to Helen's farm was no longer a lonely path. Refrigerated trucks from 3 different states rumbled down it, their drivers looking not for a pristine farm, but for the source of the legendary fish they'd heard whispers about. They were not put off by the mud, the mosquitoes, or the wildness of the place. They understood. They knew that the terroir of the water was the very thing they were paying for. Helen never had to go looking for a buyer again. They came to her. And she controlled the conversation. She set the price, and they paid it without question, because they could not get that quality anywhere else on earth. Silas Croft watched it all from the porch of his immaculate white-pillared farmhouse. He saw the expensive trucks, their logos representing serious money from far-flung cities, drive right past his own perfectly manicured fields, past his acres of profitable sugarcane, and disappear into the swamp he had publicly declared to be worthless. He heard the stories in town, no longer of Helen's folly, but of her incredible, inexplicable success. The laughter had stopped. In its place was a stunned, grudging respect. It gnawed at him. It defied everything he knew to be true about the land, about money, about the world. One afternoon, he couldn't stand it any longer. He got in his truck and drove down the now-rutted track to the Black Cypress Basin. He found Helen not wading in the mud, but standing on a newly built wooden pier directing two workers as they loaded fish into a waiting truck. She was no longer just a girl in a swamp. She was the commander of her domain. She moved with an economy of motion and a quiet authority that was absolute. She saw him approach, but didn't stop her work. When the truck was loaded and pulled away, she finally turned to him. The silence hung between them, thick with the memory of his years of mockery. "Helen," he began, his booming voice reduced to a confused murmur. He gestured vaguely at the ponds, at the whole thriving operation. I don't understand this. How? Everyone knows this land is no good. It's just a bog." Helen looked at him, and there was no triumph in her eyes, no malice, only the calm certainty of a truth long held. "You're right," she said softly. "You saw a bog, Mr. Croft. You saw a wasteland." She paused, letting him absorb the words. "My father taught me to see an engine." Silas stared at her, then at the dark water, then back at her. The simple, profound truth of her statement dismantled his entire worldview. He, the master of the land, had only seen the surface. This young woman had understood its heart. A deep, unfamiliar feeling washed over him, the feeling of being unequivocally, publicly, and privately wrong. He shook his head slowly, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. "I was a fool," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "All this time, mocking you. I was a fool." He looked at his own hands, then at hers, which were strong and capable. "I am sorry, Helen." He extended his hand, not as a patron, but as an equal. Helen looked at it for a moment, then took it. The handshake was firm, a quiet treaty ending a long, one-sided war. The next 20 years saw the legend of Helen Marsh solidify into permanent local history. She never became a tycoon in the way Silas Croft was. She never built a grand house or paved the road to her farm. The tiny shack was eventually replaced by a modest, comfortable cypress wood home, but the heart of the operation remained the swamp itself. She acquired the adjacent wetlands, parcels equally dismissed as worthless, and expanded her system of ponds. Black cypress fish became a brand, a hallmark of quality that chefs would put on their menus by name. Helen was no longer the strange girl who bought the bog. She was the undisputed master of the wetlands, a woman who had built a small, prosperous empire not by conquering nature, but by partnering with it. She was a living lesson in a different kind of wealth. While others took on massive debt to buy more equipment, more land, more fertilizer, Helen remained debt-free. Her primary investment had been $50. Her primary input was patience. Her infrastructure was the ecosystem itself, which repaired and replenished itself for free. The land, the water, the engine her father had taught her to see, did the heavy lifting. She was merely its steward, its conductor. One day, years later, when Helen was a woman in her late 40s, her hair showing the first streaks of gray, her niece came to spend the summer. She took the young girl out on the pirogue, into the heart of the thriving farm. The girl looked at the dark water with a child's apprehension. Helen pointed to the subtle movement of the current, to the schools of minnows darting in the shallows, to the way the light filtered through the ancient cypress trees. She handed the girl a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was volume 17 of her father's journals. "The most important thing," Helen told her, her voice carrying the same quiet patience her father once used with her, "is to learn how to listen. Don't listen to what people say the land is. Listen to what the land tells you it is. It will tell you everything you need to know." The world saw a swamp and called it worthless. The experts, the farmers, the men of conventional wisdom, they all laughed. They said to drain it, to fill it, to walk away. But Helen Marsh held a different knowledge, a legacy of observation and respect passed down from her father. She knew the wealth wasn't in the dirt, but in the water. She knew the value was not in what you could take from the land, but in what the land would give if you only understood its language. They laughed at her $50 investment, but for $50 and a lifetime of patience, the swamp she listened to made her a queen.